Today we're going to talk about how a vast demographic shift will totally reshape the world and what that means for your freedom and wealth. Because for decades, the world's dominant powers have benefited from large working age populations that help drive economic growth. But those days are over. In all of recorded history, no country has ever been as old as these nations are expected to get. That's a quote from a New York Times article which talks about this total global demographic shift. I'm going to tell you a little bit later how this is going to impact your wealth and to some extent your freedom. But let's go through exactly what the New York Times put together, which shows from 1990 into about 15 or 20 years from now how the world is changing. So if you look at 1990 and look at how young the world was, you see younger populations in pretty much all of Central and South America. Of course, all over Africa. That's still the case today. We'll talk about that. All through the Middle East, Central Asia, India, most of Southeast Asia. And you saw countries like the US and Australia and UK, Germany, France being working-aged population. China, for example, Japan, those were the exceptions in Asia. Those were the more developed. I mean, China is certainly not so developed in the 1990s as it is today, but Japan was just coming off of its boom decade when everyone thought it was taking over the world, and those populations were working-aged. And so the world's dominant powers, what we've talked about recently, makes up about 15% of the world's population. Countries that operate in their own ecosystem, in their own bubble, and a bubble that I believe is bursting, they have used these large working age populations to help drive economic growth. Meanwhile, young populations, says the New York Times, in much of the developing world mean limited resources are diverted to raising children, curbing economic opportunity. But the world's demographic sweet spots, it says, are changing and fast. In 2013, a quarter of Japan's population was 65 and older, making Japan the oldest country not only in the world, but in recorded history. And soon, Western Europe will follow with record old age populations. And so if you scroll through on the New York Times website, you'll see that in 2013, when Japan reached that new level of being old, the US was still largely working age thanks to immigration. Latin America still predominantly young. You saw Colombia and Chile and Brazil becoming more working age, so fewer younger people as a percentage of the population. You're starting to see aging in countries like France, in parts of the Middle East, not so much the Gulf, but in places like Jordan and Israel, they are becoming a little bit older. And you're seeing this onward progression of Italy and then France and then the UK becoming older working age. And so now we scroll through to today in 2023, we're still largely there. You don't see a lot of countries, reaching Japan's level, but by 2025, you will see Italy reaching this older populations level that Japan currently occupies. That will be the first big country in Europe to reach that level. Portugal and then Greece will be there by the end of this decade. So will Germany. Western Europe is increasingly going to, the next 10 years, reach the levels of Japan. Now, you will also see South Korea in Asia. You will see Thailand reaching that as well. Greece again, Bulgaria. Most of Western Europe predominantly. You were seeing countries like the UK and Ireland will be a little bit older in the working age, but still working age. Interestingly enough, Scandinavia, perhaps driven by immigration, will be older working age, but still there. Places like Lithuania and Romania will still be that. A lot of the Balkans that we've talked about, Serbia, what have you, those will be slightly older, but still working age populations. Obviously, a number of younger people have historically left places in Eastern Europe to go and work overseas. You see, for example, a lot of Turks living in countries like Germany, a lot of Serbians living in Austria, Georgians live in various places like Greece and elsewhere. So those folks have often left for opportunities. What will be interesting, by the way, is to see as emerging countries take a larger and larger percent of GDP. What The Economist calls transactional and pragmatic emerging countries have gone from 11 to 18% of world GDP, which now outpaces the European Union as a block of countries. So that has been very interesting to see perhaps what happens with those people who have moved to now aging countries where they may be treated worse and worse. But we keep scrolling through the 2030s. And by the end of the 2030s, we'll see China being relatively old. There's certainly a discussion right now as to whether China continues its meteoric rise or whether at some point it fizzles out because of an aging population. And by 2040, China will be at the same level that Japan and Korea are in terms of having an older population, as well as pretty much all of Western Europe. The US, for that point, will have moved into this older working population, and most of Latin America, with the exception of Chile, will be predominantly working age. So from Mexico to Panama to Colombia, they will have gone from very young populations back when I was a kid to being very working age populations. People are paying into things like Social Security, the social programs. What's interesting is 15 years from now, at the end of the 2030s, Africa, with the exception of a few countries in Northern Africa like Egypt and, of course, South Africa, which is often kept out of the larger kind of sub-Saharan Africa conversations, will still be entirely young. There are many parts of Africa where the average age is 18, 19, 20 years old. Pakistan as well is going to be in that situation. And before you say, oh, who cares? I will tell you this. We've had a number of clients who have built very sizable businesses. They hire a lot of people from countries like Pakistan, where English is good, work is affordable. People actually believe in having a work ethic, unlike the countries where they're from. They say, I couldn't hire someone to have this good of an attitude and do this level of work in the UK or the US or Australia. I would get a lot of lip, but I can go and hire in Pakistan and pay them more than what they would make somewhere else, and we all get a good deal. So there's a lot of opportunities for people here. And what's happening is, as more people like Nomad Capitalist and our clients are hiring in these places, we've hired in Eastern Europe, we've hired in South America. We also do hire now in the West. We have people in Ireland and people from the UK and people from around Europe who have lots of experience. You are going to see that percentage of the world GDP increase. You're going to see the amount of money that these countries have increase. And remember, our feeling here is you will have an increasingly multipolar world. The US and the West does not have to go to zero for other countries to thrive and take over not only financially, but geopolitically a larger share to where the West becomes less and less relevant. And so if we just scroll through, we'll continue to see countries getting older and older. Again, even into 2050, many of today's low-income countries will have these people who are very young being prime-age labor forces. And the question is, can they take advantage of that opportunity? By 2050, people 65 and older will make up 40% of the population in parts of East Asia and Europe. And so let's talk about what that means. That, by the way, is almost twice the share of older adults than what Florida has, which they call the U.S.'s retirement capital. So 40% of the population is of retirement age, even higher in France, where I think that they're currently burning down cities to be able to retire even earlier. But don't worry, they're a first world country because they told you so. And so what the New York Times says is this is going to be a sea change for Europe, the U.S., China, and other top economies, which have had some of the top working age people in the world. And so what is the change? One of the things that I see and that we talk about here, why is it harder to open a bank account overseas? Why is it harder to make investments in other countries, including some of the ones we're talking about? Why is it harder to get citizenship by investment? Why is it harder to do things internationally if you come from Western country? Well, in many ways, it's because those Western countries are trying to throw up little roadblocks. Some of those roadblocks, it doesn't mean you can't do any of those things. It just means it's a bit more difficult, because my firm belief is countries that have had a grip on power for a long, long time do not want competition. There are monopolies in business, and there are monopolies in government. 15% of the world's population, doesn't matter what I think or what you think, but 15% of the world's population lives in a country that is firmly on the side of Ukraine. And if you live there, you think, well, that's the position. And that may be a very good position. But you have a larger percentage of the population who doesn't feel that way, and then a much, much larger population says, we don't really care. But what you have is this 15% of the world that's convinced they're the be-all and the end-all. And if you don't agree with them, they're going to go out, they're going to look to sanction you. 29% of the world's economy is now sanctioned by the United States. That's up from 8% at the turn of the century. Do you really think all these countries, as they build these working-age populations, as they have more money, as they're increasing their share of global GDP, as they're building their geopolitical might, are going to sit back and just say, you know what? Let's just have the U.S. tell us we're terrible, and let's not reach our full potential? No, and that's why you're seeing all these different monetary unions and talks of currency unions and BRICS and all these different alliances. Meanwhile, I believe that some of these countries will be very good investments. Do you know where to invest in Africa? I mean, pioneers get slaughtered, settlers prosper, goes the logic. But in the various countries of Africa, there are companies that are coming about that may not make it. And so obviously investing in Africa is a more risky proposition. I believe, having spent many, many years living abroad, that you need to have a global perspective, or at least invest with someone who does. We have at Nomad Capitalist, for example, a real estate service. And we have a team of people who live overseas. And we have networks of expert real estate agents and people on the ground who help us find properties for our clients. We're not investment advisors, but we connect you with people who, if you want to buy property in some of these emerging countries, maybe that leads to a residence permit or a citizenship or an opportunity to open a bank account well, so you get a full suite of diversification. But we can help you do that. And you can learn about how we help people buy property with on-the-ground experts at nomadcapitalist.com. So if you have someone on the ground in Africa, if you've got a team of people who understand the opportunities, you're going to have a better chance of success at earning huge returns. And we've talked to people from Africa. They're making incredible amounts of money. The same way someone in Cambodia might have 5 or 10 years ago, opening the simplest of businesses, opening a cement factory, and they just make money hand over fist. You're seeing Africa, for example, say, let's keep things in Africa. Let's have an African Union. Let's open up opportunities within our continent, and let's not, trade as much. Look at how West Africa has been treated by the aforementioned France, for example. France essentially still controls their currency union and exerts a lot of control over those countries who are on the Central African franc. And so I think a lot of people are sick of it. What you're seeing is people who are finally able to stand up for themselves in countries all over the world that have tremendous resources, including burgeoning populations. I think there's investment opportunities there. And for that reason alone, I would want to have bank accounts. South America, not as accessible in terms of good bank accounts for managing investments. But certainly Dubai offers access to the Middle East. Mauritius offers access to places like India and Africa. Singapore offers access to a lot of Asia. If you had bank accounts in those regions, you'd have access to people who and access to make investments that were good. So this is one area where having diversified bank accounts overseas is a good thing, is it gives you more opportunities to make investments in these places. Having a brokerage account, perhaps you want to buy stocks, perhaps you want to use our help to buy real estate. There are going to be a lot of opportunities in these countries. I'm not saying to live in these countries. I'm saying consider living in a country that's going to treat you well, low taxes, and they leave you alone. And I think that's going to be the challenge of where you're living right now as this demographic shift continues. Let's talk about Social Security, whether you're in the U.S. or any other Western country that's getting older and that doesn't like that other countries have this competitive advantage, let's say 20 years from now. Here's what the New York Times says. As a result, experts predict things many wealthier countries take for granted, like pensions, retirement ages, and strict immigration policies, will need overhauls to be sustainable. That's been the conversation in Japan for a long time. Japan historically not very open for immigration. We've had a few people who live in Japan, and they basically just go to Japan on tourist visas, and they just have to get waved in every 90 days, for example. Imagine 8 seniors for every 10 working-age adults. How does an already fragile Social Security system, how does that work? How does it work when 40% of populations in some countries are 65% or older? And so these countries thought that their luck would never run out, but what is the fallout going to be? You're already seeing comments. I saw someone the other day say, in the U.S., let's not have a cap on Social Security. In the U.S., you pay on, $140,000, $150,000, you pay Social Security up to that level. If you're self-employed, you double that. You pay the employer and the employee portion. And a lot of folks on the left, which is becoming increasingly repeated from what I can tell, say, why don't we take that cap off? If you make $10 million a year and you're self-employed, you should pay $1.25 million into Social Security. Why? So you can get back $2,000 a month? Because then you see even Republican presidential candidates say, no, if you make $10 million at some point, you don't need Social Security. So you're going to pay millions of dollars potentially in extra taxes. And what one of the commentators says was, my parents would love an extra $200 a month. They could go out for dinner every once in a while. You're going to pay millions of dollars because a bunch of politicians led by angry people who maybe they should be angry, but what they don't realize is their jobs, like they're not really getting much more money because all these other places are growing. And yes, the pie can grow, but it's not going to be a license to print money just by being born in a Western country anymore. You're actually going to have to compete a little bit. And the clients that we talk to, and a lot of you watching, would say, yeah, I mean, the workforce in my country is not that great. And that's why one thing we help people do is we turn them on to where they can hire people around the world for a much lower price, oftentimes with better attitudes. And sometimes it even helps their taxes. And so you're going to see more of that. Yes, there is some more nearshoring. Yes, there is some more reshoring, people bringing stuff back to their country. But experts say aging rich countries will need to rethink pensions, immigration policies, and what life in old age looks like. It is not going to be a cakewalk anymore. That, I think, will lead to some level of civil unrest. I'm not saying all the octogenarians are going to start, leading massive protests. Who knows? Maybe they will. I mean, imagine you've lived in a Western country where since World War II, life was pretty easy. Let's be honest, it was pretty easy. They charge you a lot of taxes, but for the average person, they're not paying that much in taxes. More than half of Americans don't pay a penny in federal income taxes. They think they do. They shame people like me for not wanting to pay millions, but they pay zero or very, very little. What do you think is going to happen when they no longer get to have 3 cars? And this is already starting to happen. Look at what's happening. People like Bernie Sanders are getting a lot of traction because they can't have one person or 2 people work at a job and have 3 cars and go on a holiday and have all the accoutrements of the life they've expected because there's more competition. And so if you're wealthy, number one, you can make money investing in these growing economies. And if you don't want to go all the way to Africa, I mean, certainly Singapore, I mean, they're going to be older by 2050. But there's going to be places like Indonesia we've been telling you about, the Philippines we've been telling you about. Vietnam's going to be a little bit older, but still working age. I mean, 25 years from now, these countries will still be working age. Those are places people are flocking to. If you have a bank account in Singapore, you can access funds run by people actually on the ground there. We've talked about, people like InvestAsian that help people in Cambodia. Those are countries that have very young and growing workforces. They're not going to have the problem of 8 seniors for every 10 working age adults. They're going to be taking advantage. And I hear it, by the way, when I travel these places, people saying, I believe for the first time my country has a future. We're going in the right direction. How many Westerners think that? And so your taxes are going to go up because people are going to demand that the government, it's going to be a very hard fall for some people. And I'm not rooting for people to have a worse life, but I am rooting for people in emerging countries to have an opportunity. I don't think it's right to tell them to eat 1 bowl of rice a day so that we can drive 3 cars in the West. I think everyone deserves a chance because I hire people all over the world and some of them are great. And this idea that the Western world wins by default is over. It's over in your lifetime. You will be taxed if you're successful. And so I'm going to want to have another passport. If you can get a European passport, if you're American, Australian, Canadian, what have you, fine, get a European passport. I would like to have a passport from somewhere that you consider weird. Get a Turkish passport, buy a $400,000 piece of property, you get instant asset diversification, you get a place to go, whether it's on vacation or because things are melting down, and you get a passport that is neutral, that is part of that group of places that they believe they're heading in the right direction. Yes, they've had inflation issues, but the fundamentals in terms of we're building manufacturing, building agriculture, building things to be a self-sustaining country that exports and grows, that's going in the right direction. These countries that we're talking about, the good ones, they're off the aging list, and they're going to be some of the most balanced workforces. South and Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, and I would add Latin America as well. You can go and you can invest, again, get a bank account in some of these locations that I mentioned. They may give you access to funds in some of these harder to access economies. You cannot invest, for example, with your normal brokerage account most of the time directly in Indian stocks. But if you figure out a formula for whether it's real estate, and we can help you with that at nomadcapitalist.com, whether it's a bank account that you want to get, we help people open bank accounts and deal with the compliance issues of that. Whatever you want to invest in. I think Asia is, of course, interesting. Africa, people that are talking about demographically. Kenya looks like something that South Korea was in the mid-1970s when its economy was beginning a historic rise. Pretty interesting stuff. Birth rates, they say, are slowing enough in many countries that most people who will be alive in 2050 have already been born. By 2050, much of the Western world and parts of East Asia will be very, very old. Again, I'm not saying to move to a place with these demographics. Move to a place that offers you personal freedom, that offers you lower taxes, that offers you a good lifestyle. but look at how you can get more abilities to invest in these places. If you're an American, you're already at a bit of a disadvantage in terms of the rules about investing, the rules of having bank accounts. Unfortunately, it's more difficult for you. I want to have a second passport or even a third passport that is from one of these non-aligned places. You can complain all you want that these countries, you really think Ghana's the answer? No. I think the world will be multipolar, and I think Ghana might have 0.2% now, and they'll have 0.3% later. That's a 50% increase. And I think if we look at how fast some of these countries are growing, it is 5 to 8 to even in some cases 10 times faster this century than what their Western counterparts are growing at. So there's a lot of opportunities. You may still never have heard of these places because you're going to have so many places competing that it's going to be hard to keep up with all of them. You're going to have incredible gains, and each of those places that takes 1% here, 1% there is taking it away from the West. Yes, again, the pie will get bigger. This is not a zero-sum game, but the game is going to grow a lot faster in these countries than it is in the West, and you're going to have fewer people who want to go there. And I'll tell you what, you're seeing less interest in immigrating to some of these Western countries from people as their countries get better, as they realize freedoms are on the decline. And so the idea that you're going to be able to continue to be imperious in your behavior as a Western country and attract every immigrant with talent, I think is going to change as well. The bottom line is if you're in the Western ecosystem, diversify your cash, diversify your citizenship, and be ready to live in a country where there's probably going to be some chaos and some resultant higher taxes in the next 10 to 20 years. Don't wait until that happens in the same way that you were better off to not wait until a pandemic happened, not wait until a new tax happened. Get some of these things in line now. Nomad Capitalist helps you do that. We help people put all the puzzle pieces together with a network of hundreds of experts around the world. We are the architect and the general contractor of your offshore plan. And we can help you do all these things in a highly legal and compliant way at nomadcapitalist.com.